A sword doesn't care who holds it. Power flows to whoever refuses to let go. Welcome to Echoes of Ancients. If you've been sleeping on pre-colonial Southeast Asian history, this channel will wake you up fast. Subscribe now because we're only getting deeper from here. There's a mystery buried in the Philippine archipelago, and it starts with a silence. Chinese imperial records from the Song and Ming dynasties describe thriving maritime kingdoms along the islands they called Ma'i and Lusong. Traders arrived, tribute flowed, diplomatic envoys exchanged gifts with rulers dressed in gold. Yet when scholars cross-reference these records against the names of the rulers who received those envoys, something strange appears. A significant portion of the leaders holding authority weren't men, and the Chinese scribes, men trained to document hierarchies, sometimes struggled to categorize what they encountered. They wrote the encounters down anyway. Then centuries later, those pages went quiet in the official narrative. The question isn't why women held power in pre-colonial Philippine society. The question is why that knowledge became so difficult to find. To understand the answer, you need to step back to the world before 1565. Pre-colonial Philippine society organized itself around a unit called the barangay. Each barangay was a kinship-based community, typically led by a datu. But the position of datu wasn't a pure patriarchal inheritance. Power passed through bloodlines on both sides. A woman born into a chiefly family carried nobility in her own name. She didn't borrow status from a husband, she arrived with it. This system produced something rare in the ancient world. Women who commanded not as exceptions, but as a structural feature of how authority operated. Look, the Visayan term for these women was babaylan when they held spiritual authority, and the title for political rulers varied by region, but the concept was consistent. A woman of noble blood could inherit governance. She could negotiate trade agreements. She could field warriors. The warriors obeyed because her lineage gave her the right to command. And in this world, lineage was law. Here's where the Chinese records become fascinating rather than frustrating. One detail in those records changes the entire picture. Think about it. The tributary missions to Ming China from the Philippine Islands during the 14th and 15th centuries included delegations where women appeared not as consorts or decorative presences, but as principals. In the recorded mission of 1417, the Kingdom of Butuan sent representatives to the Yongle Emperor's court. The Yongle Emperor himself was a man who'd seized power through military force and had strong opinions about hierarchical order. Well, his court scribes cataloged the delegation carefully. The political structures they described back home didn't align neatly with Confucian gender expectations. The scribes noted it. They moved on. The trade continued anyway. Chinese merchants operating in the islands had a more practical view. They needed reliable counterparts, people with the authority to guarantee contracts and protect shipments. If a woman held that authority, they traded with her. Commerce has a way of cutting through ideology. But one set of encounters stands apart from routine trade diplomacy. Multiple sources from the pre-colonial, including oral traditions, preserved by Spanish chroniclers despite their biases, describe incidents where Chinese naval commanders encountered Philippine coastal forces led by women and chose to negotiate rather than press an engagement. This wasn't colonial-era myth-making. Spanish chroniclers had no incentive to invent powerful pre-colonial women. Their entire colonial project rested on the argument that Filipino peoples needed European guidance and Christian order. Documenting capable female military commanders undermined that argument. They recorded these accounts anyway, embedded in larger documents because the accounts came from sources they trusted, local informants, and earlier Chinese documents they accessed through trade networks. To be honest, the most cited example involves the warrior leaders of the Visayas. Women of the noble class in Visayan communities trained alongside men in the martial traditions of their culture. The kris and the kampilan weren't weapons restricted by gender. Combat readiness was a mark of noble identity, and noble identity didn't divide neatly along a male-female line. Stop for a moment and sit with that. A Chinese naval commander, operating under an imperial mandate with a fleet of battle-hardened sailors, received intelligence that the force opposing him on a particular coastline was commanded by a woman of the local nobility. His recorded response, preserved in fragmented form through secondary sources, was to open diplomatic contact rather than attack. Precisely attack. Scholars debate whether this reflected genuine respect, tactical caution, or something more practical. The recognition that killing a noblewoman would make the entire trade network in that region collapse, because her kinship ties extended to every allied barangay along the coast. The answer was probably all three. The result was the same. He didn't fight. Power in pre-colonial Philippine politics wasn't military, it was relational. A Datu's authority rested on alliances sealed through blood, marriage, debt, and mutual obligation. A noblewoman sat at the center of multiple overlapping networks simultaneously. Attack her, and you attacked every person she was linked to. The math didn't favor aggression. This relational model of power is precisely what Spanish colonizers found so difficult to dismantle. Really dismantle. When Miguel López de Legazpi arrived in 1565, his forces didn't encounter a centralized empire with a single capital to capture. They encountered hundreds of interlocking political units, each with its own internal logic. The Spanish colonial strategy required breaking those units apart, rewriting local authority structures, and inserting new hierarchies. The Catholic Church provided the ideological framework. Women who held spiritual authority as babaylan became primary targets of suppression because they represented the old network in its most visible form. Remove the babaylan, and you destabilize the knowledge system that held communities together. Incidentally, this is the erasure. It wasn't a single decision made in Beijing or Madrid. It accumulated through pressure. Decades of colonial administration systematically replaced female spiritual and political authority with structures that recognized only male Christian leaders. The Spanish worked through local collaborators, some of whom were Datu, who saw advantage in the new order. The babaylan went underground, their knowledge fragmented. Their names stopped appearing in documents that would survive. Beijing's contribution to this erasure operated differently. Ming Dynasty historians, working within a Confucian framework that prescribed specific roles for women, edited their own records to fit recognizable patterns. When a Philippine ruler didn't fit the expected category, the scribes described the political situation around the ruler rather than the ruler herself. The woman became the background. The trade relationship became the foreground. Over time, the records reflect a world where authority in the islands looks more Confucian compatible than it was. You can see the gaps if you know where to look. Researchers working with Philippine oral tradition have spent decades cross-referencing epics like the Maranao Darangan and the Visayan Hinalawad against fragmentary Chinese and Spanish sources. The women who appear in those epics aren't fairy tale figures. They negotiate, they strategize, they lead forces into conflict and dictate terms afterward. The Durangan's female characters hold political agency that mirrors what the pre-colonial political structure permitted. Oral tradition preserved what the written colonial record tried to smooth over. The Hinalawad, recorded by scholars in the 20th century from oral performers in Panay, describes a world where women of the ruling class engaged directly in supernatural and military confrontations. Scholars like F. Landa Jocano, who dedicated substantial work to documenting these traditions, argued that the epics weren't pure fantasy, truly fantasy. They reflected social memory. The roles women played in the stories matched the roles that historical and archaeological evidence suggests women held in actual Visayan communities. And the archaeology supports this reading. Burial sites across the archipelago have produced graves where women were interred with weapons alongside their ornaments. This doesn't prove every woman buried with a blade was a warrior commander, but it tells you that the society doing the burying didn't find the combination of female identity and martial equipment strange. They buried people with the objects that define their lives. The blades were part of the definition. Here's the thread that connects all of this to the present moment. Filipino cultural identity spent more than 3 centuries inside a colonial framework designed to make people forget what came before. The Spanish renamed places, suppressed languages, burned documents they found threatening, and constructed an entirely new official memory. The American colonial added another layer, emphasizing a forward-looking national identity that had little room for pre-colonial depth. To be honest, Filipinos grew up learning a history that began essentially with the arrival of outsiders. The scholars who pushed back against this model faced an uphill argument because the documentary record was so thoroughly shaped by colonizers. Proving what pre-colonial society looked like required reading colonial sources against themselves, finding the admissions embedded in hostile documents, and treating oral tradition as evidence rather than entertainment. That work has been accelerating. Filipino historians, anthropologists, and independent researchers have published extensively over the past few decades, and their work is reaching audiences in ways it never could before the internet. Young Filipinos who encounter this research often describe the experience in similar terms. Recognition. The feeling that something was taken, and now a piece of it is coming back. Important. The Babaylan has become a cultural touchstone again. Feminist movements in the Philippines have reclaimed the term. Academic programs study her role. Artists build imagery around her. The figure of the pre-colonial woman who held authority in her own right has moved from obscure historiography into active cultural conversation. And the Chinese generals who refused to fight? Their caution turns out to have been well-founded. The women they declined to confront came from a political tradition sophisticated enough to survive 3.5 centuries of colonial pressure. Not intact, not unchanged, but alive in fragments, in language, in story, in the persistent sense that something important predated the arrival of ships with foreign flags. Power flows to whoever refuses to let go. Pre-colonial Filipino women understood that. The record they left wasn't in one archive or one document. They scattered it across epics, burial goods, trade records written by people who didn't fully understand what they were documenting, and the long memory of communities that kept telling the stories long after the official version said there was nothing to tell. Think about it. The history didn't disappear. It waited.